Governance's first ever Human Rights Expo in commemoration of the International Human Rights Day. This year in Guyana, we're celebrating under the theme Equal Rights, One Guyana, in keeping with President Ali's vision of a One Guyana. So today we have a lot of activities planned. We have our exhibition going on downstairs. We have 2 panel discussions today, of which this is the first. We have 3 film screenings, 3 sessions rather, which incorporate a variety of films into each session. So the schedules are all around the place. They're being circulated. They're at our booth, which is right at the front door as soon as you come in the entrance. So please check it out. You'll get all of the information about our actual discussion, titled Human Rights in the Global Landscape. And so we're looking at human rights from a national perspective, a regional perspective, and an international perspective. And so I trust that this goes well for persons tuning in live, because we are also live streaming on the Department of Information's page and also on the Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs and Governance and Minister Gail Teixeira's pages. So let's move right along with our program. And I'd like to invite our first speaker, who is Mr. Henry Yakara, the head of the National Office in UNHCR Guyana, who's been here since July of 2022 and shares an excellent working relationship with our ministry and with Minister Teixeira. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to make your first presentation.
Be displayed. Honorable Minister Teixeira, and all the other ministers present here, Your Excellency ambassadors, and all the representative resident coordinator, Yasim, and all the representative head of UN agency present in this room, and the national institution. It is a very big honor and a privilege at the same time for me to be here based on the invitation from Minister Teixeira to share our experience on how we are addressing the issue of refugees, asylum seekers, and all the other people who are forcibly displaced around the world. I think my presentation will be very small part of the big topic that we are talking about today, but I would like, first of all, honorable ministers, to congratulate you for that initiative, and to congratulate the government of Guyana, who initiated this commendable activity today, not only to celebrate the anniversary, but at the same time to raise and promote a new vision on how we can address the issue of humanitarian rights. The topic is very large, and this topic is not taking specific part of the people, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, language, political, or some opinions, national or social origin, property, be concentrated on a very small category of a group in the world who find themselves in a very difficult situation of vulnerability, and for whom we all have the responsibility to protect and assist them. We are talking about a vulnerable group. I will mainly talk about our own experience across the world as an international protection agency. With our mandate is focusing on the provision of assistance and international protection to ensure that those who are in a very critical condition can receive appropriate support. I know that many of you have a good idea about our story and also our organization, but allow me to come back and present very briefly who we are. UNHCR was established after the Second War in 1950 by the General Assembly, and more than 137 countries where we are operating across the world in all the continent. At the same time, based on the work, the remarkable work that we have done in the past, our agency had the privilege to receive 2 Nobel Prizes, one in 1954 and one in 1981. And as I was mentioning, we talk about a vulnerable group, and today, when we observe the trends, it's continuously increasing. And today we are talking about 100 million persons in need of international protection. What we do? We are working very closely with the government of the country where we are operating. And we are coordinating all our response with the government, with the national and international organizations, with the civil society, and also I would like to thank here our donors, because without their support, we will not be able to provide support to the most vulnerable people. I will not go through all the activity that we are doing, because the slide is displayed here, and you will have an idea about what we are doing in terms of international protection to people who are in need. But I would like to mention the most important thing, the international protection and life-saving assistance that we are providing to people. At the same time, the importance of looking for sustainable solution, which is part of the big area of priority for us, because it's not only providing support to the vulnerable people, but at the same time prepare how they can find appropriate solution for their own life. At the same time, victims of natural disasters can receive also support from our side, because when we are working in cluster, in some condition, we are able to provide that support. And one of the most important thing is to provide technical support to the government in many areas. Then, while we are providing the support, it is a package of activity and response that we are going up. You can see from the slide, the protection, and we often say that protection is starting by providing documentation and also knowing the people that we're supposed to deal with. So the protection is very important, and followed by all the other activity, including provision of non-food items, support, durable solution, livelihood activities, etc. Next. Next slide, please. Today we are celebrating the Human Rights Day. And when I was talking about our international protection mandate, it is fully part of the Human Rights Declaration. And I would like to insist on two key articles. The Article 14, which said very clearly everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in all the country asylum from persecution. And the second one, which is related to stateless people, everyone has a right to a nationality. This is very key. And when we are talking about the protection, it is a package, and maybe you will get more from what in the declaration next. We have a strategy, and if you want to know more about that strategy, we have a link here that can be shared with you, and you can see how we integrate our activity in line with the Human Rights Declaration. Key definition, I'm not going to read it, but it is very important to make the difference. When we are talking about refugees, we are talking about those people who flee their country to protect their life from situations like conflict, war, and persecution. And it is important to mention that they are protected and they are determined through the international law. And talking about the international law, I'm referring to the Convention of 1951 on the refugees and the protocol of the related protocol of 1967, which complete the Convention of 1951. One of the principles is that refugees or asylum seekers should not be expelled or returned to situations where their life and freedom will be under threat. This is one of the key points that I would like to highlight in this circumstance. But it is important to mention that when we are talking about protection, the safety and well-being of those people are very important and very key. When we refer to the solution, it is important that we make sure that the solution can be sustainable, and also make sure that those people that the vulnerable can receive solution in terms of security and also dignity. But once again, the state government has the main responsibility to protect them. Just very quickly, for the asylum seekers, I've already mentioned that, but we have other groups like the internal displaced person, who are those people who move from the area of origin, but they remain in the territory, but they are also under the responsibility of the government. Next. Last point, it's about the migrant. We talk a lot about the migrant, and I don't want to go through details here, but those people, when we compare to the previous category, they can decide, because for some reason, they can decide to go back to their home without any threat if the condition allows. Next. I would like to show you here the trends, some trends of the movement of refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, and migrants. And you can see very clearly since 2012, the trends continue to grow. So that means many people continue to face some protection issues. Next. Here we can see very clearly that women and children are mainly part of this group. So it is important that we keep in mind that those groups are very vulnerable and they need specific support. With your permission, I would like you to follow that very short video, and I will conclude with one last slide that can present to you our story. And it is a package of activities starting from the beginning, where our agency was established, up to how we deal with some major crises around the world, and also some of the good practice that I will share later. Video. Thank you. Maybe time for the video to be displayed. Let me just continue with the next slide. While dealing with refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and also migrants, we can share some of the key challenges that they are facing. The main challenge is access to documentation, which is also part of the big issue that refugees, asylum seekers are facing around the world, and that can also prevent them to get access to solutions. Solutions like voluntary repatriation, and also resettlement, or settlement, and also some of the related connected activity that we have. Deportation in some condition in some countries. The lack of asylum system in some countries can also prevent refugees, asylum seekers, and also internally displaced to get access to proper support. In many countries where we have the system in place, the long delay in proceeding with the status can prevent also the refugees or asylum seekers to get access to proper support. One of the things that I would like to mention is the fact that they are exposed to many protection risks, like GBV, gender-based violence, and child protection problem, and also discrimination in some of the countries that they are facing. So I will stop there and give the opportunity for the video for you to have an idea about what we have.
The faces tell our story. The displaced, the disowned, the deprived. They are who we are, who we help. Lives uprooted, torn apart by wars, conflicts, persecution, natural disasters. All of them people of concern for the United Nations Refugee Agency. The Second World War left nations torn apart and refugees fleeing their homelands. More than 1 million of them. Governments needed help. The crisis needed coordination. In December 1950, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established. In July 1951, the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees was adopted. A refugee is someone outside his or her own country and unable to return as a result of a well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a social group. Its founders thought UNHCR's task would take just 3 years. They were wrong. In 1956, Hungarians rose up against Soviet occupation and were crushed. 200,000 people fled their country. It was UNHCR's first emergency. The 1960s saw decolonization in Africa and wars, independence wars, civil wars, border wars. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee. Refugees were no longer just a post-World War European issue. They could be found across the world. And so the legal foundation guiding UNHCR's work was changed in the 1967 protocol. It would have global responsibility for refugees. In the 1970s, the spotlight of conflict shone on Latin America and Asia. In the 1980s and 1990s, new wars erupted in Africa, the Middle East, Southern Europe. The numbers of those in need spiraled upward in Lebanon, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Uganda. In 1951, UNHCR started with 34 employees. By the end of 2016, it had over 10,800 employees in 128 countries, recognized with Nobel Peace Prizes in 1954 and 1981. At the end of the 20th century, in a world of civil wars, ethnic conflict, natural disasters, there were new victims. Driven from their homes but not their countries. UN guiding principles identified a new group of people in need, the internally displaced. Internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. As conflicts have altered, so has the role of UNHCR. In the Balkans, UNHCR moved to work directly in the conflict zones, something it had not done in its first 4 decades. It continues to do so to this day. In the new century, the world now has the largest number of refugees since World War II. Long, bitter wars in Somalia and Afghanistan, strife in Central African Republic, Nigeria, South Sudan, Iraq, Syria, a country fractured, bleeding, its people ripped from their homes. 22.5 million refugees, the highest number ever recorded. 40.3 million displaced in their own country. At sea, thousands of lives lost, Syrians, Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians, all in search of a safer life. 1 person is forcibly displaced every 3 seconds. And at least 10 million people worldwide are stateless. They lack a nationality, depriving them of rights most people take for granted: education, healthcare, and legal papers. The challenges grow alarmingly. UNHCR, more than 6.5 decades after its birth, will face them all, innovating and adapting and counting on a protection mandate that is one of the strongest in international law, partnerships with over 900 other agencies, and strong support from donors, governments, and people like you.
And people like you. Include the government, the international community, and national organization. The resource mobilization, I was mentioning the key role that the donors are playing in emergency response, and doing monitoring and reporting, prevention, and finding solution. These people need you. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Mr. Yakara. I think that was a very insightful presentation, offering us a better understanding of some of the work that the UNHCR does in Guyana, but also giving us a perspective of the global landscape, which is really and truly part and parcel of the reason we're here this morning. I think the YouTube video is excellent. These are resources that are available online and very easily accessible. I think in the last decade, information has become more accessible than ever before. And so I encourage persons in the room and also our viewers online to utilize the resources that are accessible online. I know that the UN has a lot of videos and other materials available online. Government and state agencies has also ensured that information is easily accessible so as to ensure accountability, transparency, participation, and inclusion. So we'll move right along with our next presentation. And our next presenter is His Excellency René Vaness, who is the European Union Ambassador to Guyana and Suriname, also relatively new to Guyana, but definitely not new to the region. So please put your hands together for High Commissioner.
Your Excellency Minister Teixeira, Minister Persaud, Minister Parak, colleagues from the diplomatic community, ladies and gentlemen, young people from Peace Corps. It's great to be here this morning and to give you a few words about the human rights perspective, the global human rights landscape with a European perspective. When I saw that and with an invitation to speak for 15 minutes, I wasn't sure if 15 minutes was far too long or far too short. You can talk about that probably for a month and still not be exhausted. And yet 15 minutes is long if you have to say a few meaningful words. Still, I will try, so bear with me. I'm very happy to be able to do that, to speak on behalf of the European Union. And as you know, European Union has 27 member states. And you may ask yourself, how can you speak on behalf of 27 member states? Well, I think if there is one thing that unites EU member states, it is their belief in human rights and to uphold human rights, to protect human rights. And so I actually feel pretty comfortable to be here and to talk. Before I go into my little presentation about what the EU does on human rights and how the Human Rights Declaration has actually influenced the whole birth of the EU, if you like, I would actually like to sort of test your knowledge a bit about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think I will take a few young people to test their knowledge. So if I look at you and you're sort of nicely positioned right in front of me, can you, I don't know, maybe you are in the middle of me, green shirt, yes, you already feel that I'm looking at you. Can you give me a few human rights? When you think about the Universal Declaration, what are the first that come to your mind? I'm sorry, I think you have to, you can push the button, no? Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You have been delegated to give an answer on her behalf?
I think so. I think I got subbed in whether I like it or not. But in the UN Rights Declaration of Rights, if I'm not mistaken, there's pursuits of liberty and freedom. There's pursuits of equal employment, Those are just some off the top of my head, I guess.
You're a bit difficult to hear from me. I have nice music in the background.
Yeah, hopefully some Christmas music.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess just to say it again, equal employment, rights of equality, as well as rights of freedom and liberty of movement and participation in civic engagement.
Yeah, that's certainly not bad. Would you say that the Universal Declaration would say something about you playing soccer? Is that part of it or not? Soccer? Is that part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? No, you would say no? Well, I mean, I'm throwing this out not only because the Netherlands lost yesterday from Argentina, and so soccer is on my mind. Don't cry for me, Argentina. No, we cry ourselves. Okay. But, well, I mean, no, soccer is not in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but Article 24 says that everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. To be honest, when I reread the Universal Declaration last night, I had forgotten that it is about this. My point is, often people think that the Universal Declaration is only about freedom, it's about your ability to be who you want to be, so the universality of human rights. But they actually talk about economic rights as well, they talk about social rights as well, as they are equally important in order to be able to live a full and free life. So is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are human rights Western values? Well, I hear that, when I travel, sometimes people say, well, you with your Western values. Well, I think it's very important to stress that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and therefore human rights themselves, they're not Western values, they're universal values, and they apply to everyone, regardless of where you are born, and what your belief is, and what your gender is, and what your thoughts or expressions are. So they apply equally to everyone, and that is very important, especially in this world. So on the basis of the Universal Declaration, which was signed in 1948, maybe a nice fact to know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the most translated document in the world. I didn't know that, but apparently it's translated in 500 languages. Do we have 500 languages? Well, apparently we have. It's incredible. So it's the most translated, which is great. So a lot of people actually know about them. So 2 years after they were signed in 1948, the European Union signed its European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. I have to read this because I always get this wrong. So that was based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and was really one of the core elements on which the EU itself was founded. So today, indeed, 27 member states that work together on all different levels to uphold human rights. So regardless our different languages, our different cultures, that is really what unites the EU. And shared values and common objectives, that is also UNHCR was created. And I thought when we agreed on the Universal Declaration, that once we put that on paper, everyone would understand. But I think it is more necessary than ever to make sure that we remain vigilant. Two concerns that I want to share with you. Democracy worldwide is more under threat now than it probably has been ever. 70% of the world population now lives in autocratic regimes. 70%. That is absolutely incredible. This is not an EU statistic. This is probably from the UN. or another entity that I can blame for this, but it's a staggering figure. Of course, I have to talk a bit about Ukraine. Ukraine is a very, very sad reminder that human rights are not a given. And when we all agreed about the Universal Declaration in 1948, that date is not, of course, a coincidence. It is after the Second World War, and we basically promised each other we would never experience something like that again. And now in Europe, we have a war of such a scale that you can hardly believe it. So Russia's illegal, unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine is indeed causing inconceivable human suffering. But we're also worried about what is happening in Afghanistan, in Belarus, in Ethiopia, in Myanmar, countries where we see very grave human rights abuses. We're worried about what is happening in China, and of course Iran was a very recent reminder that human rights are not interpreted as being universal. And in all of these human rights violations, what we see is that women and girls are the first to suffer and really take the brunt of the war. So what do we do about it? Well, the Universal Declaration still functions as a lighthouse. It is still the guiding principle. It is still what keeps us on a straight line. That is what we agreed upon all together in 1948, and that is what we should try and live by. So I'm aware of the time. I will say a few words about what the EU does at a policy level, at an action level, and sort of at empowering individuals to make that happen. And Minister, you will tell me if I go far above my allocated time. He's in charge. Right, okay. Excellent. So at a policy level, I will be brief. So if a big entity like the EU talks about human rights at a global level, the first partner we have is the United Nations. And so we really and truly believe that defending a multilateral system is in the interest of us all. So we really are the biggest defenders of the United Nations and of multilateral systems, and countries that have a conflict with their neighbors on territories or else, we really will always promote them to seek the guidance of the recognized international bodies to find a peaceful settlement to those conflicts. We have, as the European Union, an ambassador for human rights. It's my good colleague Eamon Gilmore. He travels the world to promote human rights on behalf of the EU, and that's how important we think it is that we have dedicated a full office to human rights promotion. We are probably the biggest financier of civil society in the world, so wherever there are human rights defenders that are in need of help, in all countries where the EU works, these people can count on our support. And since, I believe, 2 or 3 years, a sanction regime which is based on human rights. So now we can have EU sanctions against entities or people that are violating human rights. So that is recognized as a ground to put sanctions in place. If you want to read about this, then read the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy 2020-2024, because everything we do is fully transparent. So if you want to know more, please go there and visit that website. So in terms of action, just talked a bit about policy. Action, we support all those entities that are upholding those that are responsible for human rights violations. For example, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Not an EU body, but we are really supportive of that. A few very practical things. Again, war on Ukraine, that absorbs a lot of resources, both financial and human resources. EU has made 9 billion available to provide assistance. The EU is making support available to the armed forces in Ukraine, and that's actually for the first time in history that we have decided that we have to provide support to the armed forces. And we are now helping with the investigation and the prosecution of war crimes committed in Ukraine. We provide on a global scale election observation support, something that we have done in Guyana as well in 2020 to make sure that those principles are being upheld. We only do that at the request of governments, of course. We build local capacity on human rights, and I have to mention this as that's what I did for the last 8 years in Brussels. We have a whole team that is promoting conflict prevention, world does peace mediation. I will go to the last page where I will talk a little bit about what we do in order to promote action on the ground. Here I have to start with mentioning Spotlight. You have, of course, been reminded of Spotlight during the 16 days of activism. And Minister Persaud has mentioned this many times, and it can't be said enough, so I will just mention it once more. For me, that is a real, very concrete program where the EU is funding the Spotlight initiative at the global scale, and also here in Guyana, as gender-based violence is, of course, a very serious human rights violation where we all have to fight against. We're doing much more here in Guyana, and I will not read the list to you. ChildLink is one of the organizations that we support, which is all about making sure that children are safe from sexual abuse, that communities can respond, for example, also during the migrant crisis and during COVID-19. We also have, as the EU, a Human Rights Award. I just want to mention this, as a few weeks ago, I handed over the Human Rights Award 2022 to Anand Persaud, who is the editor-in-chief of Stabroek newspaper, for his excellent reporting on the war in Ukraine, and of course also because we feel that a strong press is absolutely essential in a functioning democracy. I think I will stop here. I wanted to say something about future challenges to human rights. I will just name them and not go into them at all. Climate change, but you will have a session later today. That is absolutely brilliant. And digitalization. And I feel that the whole discussion on digitalization is maybe something we can discuss next year, because I'm sure, Minister, you will continue this event. Let me stop here. Let me stop here by saying that I congratulate you on putting this day together. I think it is really good, and I hope it will get the attention that it deserves. And the last words will be that the EU will always continue to be a supporter, a defender, and someone that will speak out about human rights at all podia. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Once again, I think it's giving us a better perspective of the global landscape. I think some of the statistics and information provided is definitely important for our uses locally. I think the most astonishing one for me was the 70% of the global population living in undemocratic states. I can say, because this is the work of the Parliamentary Affairs and Governance, and you can get the brochure downstairs, that in an effort to strengthen Guyana's democratic framework in Parliament, between October 2020 to December 2022, there have been approximately 60 pieces of legislation passed dealing with a realm of different issues, but all somehow or the other closely related to a comprehensive democratic framework. So I'll move on to our third speaker, who is Ms. Michelle Braffett, who is the coordinator for the English-speaking Caribbean at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, based in Panama. Ms. Braffett.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Minister Teixeira, UN Resident Coordinator, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in these events today. May I first start by saying congratulations, Minister Teixeira, on an incredible exhibition. It was something that I hadn't quite anticipated. It's a very impressive show of information and the work that Guyana is doing towards, in many different ways, towards advancing its human rights agenda. I'm so pleased to see it because it shows me that Guyana, as a United Nations member state, is really doing much, and many of the elements of what you are doing is tracking the Secretary General's, the UN Secretary General's call to action on human rights. The Secretary General's call to action on human rights was launched in February 2020, and it is aimed at bringing the human rights pillar of the United Nations to the forefront of our agenda. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with the Guyana government today in seeing the SG's call to action come to fruition, so that's excellent. So I have been asked to speak about the human rights situation or the human rights landscape in the Caribbean context. My mandate as regional coordinator is really to cover the English-speaking countries in the Caribbean, so that's where my specialty is and that's what I'm going to speak about. I have a lot invested in a lot of what we're going to discuss. I am going to try to not to speak too long because I really would like today to be very interactive, but I also would like to speak forthrightly and honestly about some of the challenges that this region is facing over the last few years. So all English-speaking Caribbean countries share a similar colonial past, and thus we have similar histories, both economic, political, and social. And these result in certain realities as it relates to our legal systems and the human rights challenges that we face that are somewhat common, although many of them are very specific to the Caribbean region. So we've already heard the reference, of course, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And it's very relevant because, of course, the Universal Declaration will celebrate its 75th anniversary next year. But it's important for me to point out that the Declaration is just that. It's a declaration. But the principles in the Declaration are codified in the international human rights treaties that all Caribbean countries are party to, although no Caribbean country is party to all 9 of the core treaties. That is still something that we are working towards. And it's important to bear in mind that these treaties are not just an expression of assent to the principles. These are legal obligations that countries take on when they ratify the treaties. They're legal obligations to the international community. So one of the things that the OHCHR, my agency, works with countries to do is to increase their ratifications and the work that they are doing to implement those principles on the ground. So I have to kind of mention the necessity for us to kind of take our international human rights treaty system seriously and in implementing the principles in national and domestic legislation. So what I will do now is I'll just quickly go over generally what some of the human rights concerns are in the Caribbean region, and then I'll highlight and speak a little bit more specifically about a few of them. But as I mentioned before, the common historic, economic, and social background of many Caribbean countries sometimes results in very similar patterns of human rights abuses across the region. The ambassador mentioned, for example, economic, social, and cultural rights, which in most countries are not anchored in their constitutions. And as such, we have not necessarily seen them fully implemented on the ground, which is why we see a lot of the widespread economic and social inequality that we see across the region now. And it has expressed itself not just in inequality, but we also then see in ways in which Caribbean countries are working to address those concerns, increasing external debt levels as well. I think that we're all familiar with the fact that gender-based violence remains a serious concern throughout the region, affecting both women as well as children, and is really one of the more persistent primary human rights challenges. In spite of the advancements that we have seen in social equality over the course of many decades after colonialism, we still have concerns and human rights challenges in regard to discrimination on the grounds of race, color, class, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, and health status. And these patterns of discrimination, coupled with the fact that most countries have very little legislative protection, usually results in many minority groups not fully realizing the full suite of human rights available to them. One of the issues that the Caribbean is well known for is known to be a retentionist region of the death penalty, which continues to enjoy broad public support, in part due to increasing citizen insecurity, right? Our prison situation across the region remains of deep concern. Most prisons tend to be overcrowded and the conditions are quite dire. And that only actually got exacerbated as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. In spite of these different challenges that we've spoken about, our human rights protection frameworks in the region are somewhat weakened. No Caribbean country has a national human rights institution that is compliant with the Paris Principles. A national human rights institution is basically a national mechanism that is fully independent, that is empowered to hear human rights concerns, and is empowered to address those concerns. And the Caribbean stands out in this regard. Most countries, most regions do have these mechanisms in place, and we are working with Caribbean countries towards seeing that come to fruition. But in the absence of a national human rights institution, it is also of deep concern that our administration of justice systems are also quite weak, and in the ability of our judicial systems to hear human rights concerns and address human rights concerns are also quite weak. The ambassador mentioned the EU support of the civil society sector. It is critical because civil society across the world has served an important role in pushing forward, a national course. On top of everything I mentioned, the threat of climate change also impacts the kind of rights realization that people in the Caribbean can enjoy. And it will be doing so probably to a greater and greater extent moving into the future. I would be remiss if I also did not speak about the concern regarding migration. We have seen increasing migration patterns in the regions, particularly as it relates to Venezuelan and Haitian migrants. And our countries, for the most part, experience a lack of institutional preparedness to respond to a number of the vulnerabilities of these populations. We heard about the number of vulnerabilities that migrant populations face from my colleague from UNHCR. So amid patterns of discrimination, lack of access to justice, we've seen pushbacks at sea, and even collective deportations without judicial guarantees, all of impunity, and a justice system that really requires strengthening. As a result of citizen insecurity in many countries, it kind of feeds into the public support of a more punitive justice system, which includes, of course, a death penalty, although the death penalty there has been a de facto moratorium on the death penalty in this region for many decades now, but it still remains on the books in many countries. Up until recently, Barbados had a mandatory death penalty on the books. In Trinidad and Tobago, it still exists. And in spite of international pressure and the fact that an execution has not happened in this region for many years, there's still not a lot of political will to actually do away with it completely. I mentioned the fact that there's a support for these kind of more punitive judicial systems. And in many countries in the Caribbean region, we have seen extrajudicial killings and excessive use of force, arbitrary detentions by police officers. Again, something that people are willing to tolerate because of the nature of insecurity that they are feeling. Very recently in Jamaica, we've seen more declarations of states of emergency in the country, which usually empowers, a greater use of force as it relates to law enforcement. So as we move forward and we hope to work with Caribbean governments to find alternative forms of justice that might not necessarily feed into a system that could allow for additional human rights abuses. I had mentioned the frailty of our judicial systems, and access to justice remains a major concern. Lack of information for rights holders. The general public has a lack of information as it relates to our judicial systems. Legal aid services for people in need of assistance are underdeveloped and frequently understaffed. And it shouldn't therefore be much of a surprise that 9 countries in the Caribbean region have double the world average of incarceration. And I'd mentioned the fact that prison conditions are dire. I mean, the reality is in many countries in this region, we have a phenomenon of very lengthy pretrial detention periods. And those lengthy periods, which can last for years and years, then contribute to a problem of case backlogs for many years, and certainly contributes to prison overcrowding. I'd mentioned the national human rights institutions previously. As I said before, no country in the region has a national human rights institution which conforms with the Paris principles. And again, those principles speak to the independence of the institution to be empowered to hear human rights concerns. Now, we have had really good conversations and partnerships in the region recently, moving towards national human rights institutions. Certainly in Guyana, we have had those conversations. In Jamaica, there's been an agreement that the Public Defender's Office will be transitioned into a national human rights institution. There's a suggestion that for other Caribbean countries, we transition the ombudsman's offices into national human rights institutions. But none of this has happened just yet. So the reality is that national human rights protection frameworks still require substantial strengthening. Earlier before, I'd mentioned the concern remains a pervasive problem throughout the region, and the UN shows that domestic and sexual violence in this region continues to be at a very, very high level. But again, we are working with Caribbean governments to address these concerns, especially as it relates to legislative reform. Over the last decade or so, we have seen a number of Caribbean countries introduce or reform legislation as it relates to sexual offenses, to broaden the Sexual Offenses Act, to now incorporate things like sexual harassment, and stalking. We've seen revisions of the Domestic Violence Act to reach more persons, to kind of broaden the definition of domestic violence so that it's not gender specific anymore, that it incorporates different kinds of relationships as well. So there has been movement towards kind of addressing the issues with gender-based violence, although we still nonetheless have to kind of push against sort of cultural gender stereotyping regarding relationships, and a sense to some extent of impunity as it relates to gender-based violence. About gender equality, sometimes it's a controversial thing to bring up in this region, because when you speak about gender equality, one of the first things you will hear is about women and girls' educational attainment. And there's no question that women and girls in the Caribbean have reached a very high level of educational attainment, which is usually linked to economic and financial prosperity. But the reality nonetheless remains that even though women make up a significant amount of the labor force, they still earn significantly less than their male counterparts. Women frequently occupy positions that are precarious, are lower paying, and are less secure. And across the region, although this is changing, but across the region, we still see that women tend to be underrepresented in political and public life. And the reality is that the gender machinery in many of our countries remain somewhat underfunded and undersupported. And as a result, we really cannot dedicate we have not yet dedicated the kinds of resources we should to addressing gender equality. I'd mentioned discrimination earlier when I was speaking. Discrimination and social exclusion prevents vulnerable and marginalized groups from having access to a number of different rights. Again, coming back to the economic, social, and cultural rights that we mentioned before. Access to a quality education is a right. Access to employment is a right. Access to health care is a right. Access to housing is a right. And for many different minority groups, this is not necessarily fully realized. LGBTI persons, certain religious minorities, indigenous persons, persons living with HIV, and certain persons living with disabilities are all at increased risk. We also again heard about the situation of migrants, who are often amongst some of the most vulnerable and marginalized, and can be easily coerced into different forms of exploitation, including human trafficking, which is also a concern in the region. We also have a problem that, this discrimination is sometimes either kind of reinforced in the law, or is not necessarily addressed properly in the law, whether directly or indirectly. And one of the ways in which discrimination is still codified in many Caribbean countries, it relates to the LGBTQ community. Now, you will hear that even though these laws remain on the books, they're not, they're really not enforced. But the reality is, as long as these laws remain on the books, it contributes to a high level of stigma and discrimination that these groups are subject to. So most Caribbean countries still have what are called, for all intents and purposes, the sodomy laws that criminalize same-sex relationships, that can be criminalized up to 30 years in prison. So again, even we haven't seen necessarily those kinds of sentences, it still contributes to a cultural and social dynamic that can be highly discriminatory. Now, in terms of some of the changes that we are seeing in this region, in this area, there has been quite some positive change in that there's been a strategic litigation initiative that has been spearheaded by civil society, supported by international CSOs. That we've seen a number of court cases brought in different Caribbean countries, especially right now, there are a number of cases pending in the Eastern Caribbean that have seen the courts strike down these discriminatory laws. And we expect that we'll continue to see that pattern moving forward in the future. I mentioned the migrant situation. We certainly, when we speak of migrants, especially in this part of the Caribbean region, Venezuelan migrants come to mind. But I also actually did some work on Haitian migrants in the northern part of the region. Very, very difficult situation. The reality is that in times of crisis, we tend to see xenophobia and discrimination increase. Certainly, we saw that when it came to the COVID-19 crisis, and I documented some of that phenomenon in the Bahamas post-Hurricane Dorian. We saw, that Haitian refugees were, kind of subject to a number of different treatment by law enforcement and security forces that they were really not in a position to defend themselves from. And as I think we've talked about, as my colleague from UNHCR talked about today, we don't necessarily have legislation, or sometimes we have conflicting legislation as it relates to the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, who still face major hurdles frequently accessing economic, social, and cultural rights like education, healthcare, and employment. I want to just kind of finish up here talking about a couple of the areas in which we don't frequently, or we don't talk enough about human rights. So I'd mentioned before that even before the COVID-19 crisis, Caribbean small states were among some of the most heavily indebted in the world. And generally speaking, in the past anyway, the government response to these sorts of debt levels was to introduce stabilization and adjustment programs that resulted in reductions in spending in public health, in education, and in the housing sectors, all critical rights areas, which of course most heavily affect those, of course, living in poverty, children, people living with disabilities, and the elderly. So the issue of sovereign debt, foreign debt, and its impact on economic, social, and cultural rights is one that we need to investigate more, discuss more, analyze more. And of course, as was raised before, the issue of climate change. I would like to kind of end with this one because climate change, of course, is becoming an increasing concern for the Caribbean region. It has had a significant social and economic impact. We have seen in the last 5 years 6 extreme weather events in the region. In 2017, Hurricane Maria caused widespread devastation in Dominica, and Hurricane Irma destroyed almost all of Barbuda. In 2019, as I mentioned, Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas and had devastating effects on the Abacos. I saw that firsthand. And the reality is that the lack of Caribbean countries' capacity and resources in areas of preparedness and response to these increasingly severe natural disasters has also resulted in significant delays in recovery and reconstruction, leaving many persons, especially all of those vulnerable persons and groups that I talked about before, without access to clean water, to healthcare, to education, and to social services. The FAO, in fact, has indicated that as it relates to climate change, the Caribbean has experienced, either directly or indirectly, losses exceeding $3 billion over the last 3 decades. And it has had detrimental effects on all scopes of life in the Caribbean. That includes food production, human health, our ecosystems, tourism, freshwater availability, energy production, livelihoods, human productivity, and economic development. All of these areas critical to the enjoyment of human rights. One of the really positive things that has kind of come from this situation, however, is the rise of some Caribbean leaders as being a very visible, vocal face in as it relates to climate justice and the human rights implications of climate change. Prime Minister Mia Mottley, she's the Prime Minister of Barbados, as it relates to climate change and its impact on southern countries. And she has argued, very specifically for certain measures that should be taken, including ensuring that there's concessional financing for climate vulnerable countries, grant-funded reconstruction financing vehicles when these natural disasters hit our countries. And she's highlighted the fact that without these measures, it's going to result in an increasing number of what is now called climate refugees. As it stands right now, there's approximately, I think it was 22 million climate refugees are estimated, and by 2050, it's estimated that number will become 1 billion. And you can well imagine the human rights implications of that many people on the move as a result of the impacts of climate change that we cannot necessarily properly address with our human rights agenda. So that is what I will leave it with right now. I've covered quite a bit of ground, but I just want to reemphasize that these challenges that I mentioned are not necessarily specific to only specific to the Caribbean, but we experience them in specific ways because we are small island developing states with limited financial and human resources. And the United Nations, especially the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, my agency, works with Caribbean governments, especially through our different human rights processes, such as the Universal Periodic Review or implementing the human rights treaties that countries have ratified. We work with countries to implement the human rights recommendations and guidance on the ground, which ideally would move forward the country's human rights agenda nationally. So I have to say again, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this exposition, in this exhibition, and in this day. The discussions that we are having today, I think, would certainly support Guyana in meeting its human rights goals and agenda, and we certainly look forward to continuing our support moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Prophet. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask our final speaker, the Honorable Gail Teixeira, Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Governance, to make her presentation. Minister Teixeira.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I hope you're finding this session interesting. To start from the international, regional, down to the specific, Guyana. So, and that's my old political training that always start from the international perspective, and then you come down to the national. So that's an old political training that I've gone through over the decades. But it's important today to recognize that this is the first time we're trying with this exhibition, and really in recognition that although the world seems smaller and information is faster and easier, and not like in the 70s, you waited 6 weeks for a magazine, a newspaper, or a letter. Click at a button, you can find out what's going on. And yet I find that there is less knowledge, not information, knowledge about human rights, about how it impacts on your life, and what your role as an individual is in the universal humanity where we live. And so this whole exhibition was driven by a recognition that we needed to inform people, educate people, and see the linkages between things that are taking place in the world with our country, with what we do in our country, what we don't do in our country. So the assumption many times that people know their rights. They generally don't, or they don't see the connection with what's going on in their country. And so this is what we're trying to do. But let me just, I can't resist making a point about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So please forgive me. But I'm not apologizing for being a woman. But the 75th anniversary is next year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the women who was key is Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the First Lady of the American president. But there were many other women who were part of it, from Lebanon, from Dominican Republic, from Norway, from different countries. And I think it's time that the UN writes the history, her story, of the women who are behind the Declaration on Human Rights, the woman who was behind the creation of the World Court in The Hague, where I was recently, to do with the border issues. We women keep trying to get our stories written. And someone says to me, "Oh, you write it." Well, I can't do all these things at the same time. I'm not a superwoman. So I'd like to write my story. I'd like to write the story of many women in Guyana, really telling us about the women who drove the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt drove it, but there were other women. Can we just make sure that they're known? And the same thing with the World Court, which we were recently before. That's just my, one little, forgive me, I can't resist. But the speakers today have created a range of information. And when you listen to the Secretary General on his message on human rights, and by the way, another quib, December 10th. December is a month of rain in Guyana. All the great, some really important observances are in this month. Disabilities, the 16 days of activism for women, Anti-Corruption Day, Human Rights Day, all in December. Rain, which really poses challenges to us. But anyway, no, it's not going to change. It's going to get worse. We've had rain all year, unlike our seasons. So, but the UN Secretary General's comment, the statement, which was succinct but really powerful, in the sense that the world is facing unprecedented and interlocking challenges to human rights. And that can summarize almost everything we've been talking about today, of the linkages between that, and how are we to address them. We have, the world today has, you see the levels of civil conflict, of war, of invasion of Ukraine. You see the delicacy in the very fragile state of the world in terms of particular areas of the world. We see old stories, old fights, old struggles for human rights with the Palestinian people, to have a nation, a state, to be recognized. We see the conflicts within worlds. We see the impact of climate change on famine, on terrible conditions that people have been forced to be displaced internally. And the challenge of the younger generation, for all of us, but the younger generation in particular, is to be able to be a strong participant in the struggle to maintain human rights, preserve human rights and democracy in the world. Democracy and human rights are the key pillars, the foundation on which we have a chance in the world to survive and to be able to provide for our people and to recognize, you know, when you look at the world, and the UN Secretary General pointed out, the increase in the issues of discrimination based on whether it's nationality, ethnicity, gender, on creating a more tolerant world. It doesn't mean you have to agree with whether someone is this way or that way, but to tolerate, to be tolerant, and to recognize that people have their rights and their rights to be equal to anybody else. We see the rise of discrimination, of racism, of gangs that abuse and beat people based on their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, and so on. And so these are continuing struggles we have globally as well as in many parts of the world. And of course, the overarching one for all of us in the world is climate change. That is the overarching one that affects us all. So that I remember one day speaking in Parliament in the 1990s, and there was a whole discussion on environment, and as a Minister of Health, talking about the impact. At that time, we talked about the ozone layer. And so talking about the fact that in many parts of the world, the disease patterns will change. And you'll get malaria in parts of Russia and Europe, and you'll get different types of disease patterns in those of us that were just near the equator. And that the emerging diseases, as well as the old diseases that we thought we channeled, tuberculosis, for example. And so these climate change impacts in a multiplicity of layers, changing the lives of people. And so I'm very proud of my country for the way we have, and we believe that we are, and forgive us that we are sometimes a little bit show off about it, but we are proud that in 2010 we came out with a low carbon development strategy as the first country in bringing that whole concept of low carbon development strategy as a national development policy, and in which to try to deal with our reality. Low-lying country, we live, look, if you look outside the windows there, we're below the seawall. So it's real. The seawall is above us to keep us safe. And so our low carbon development strategy was our attempt after many consultations on how are we going to deal with this. We're a developing country, as Ms. Braff had pointed out. And so debt, we were one of the most indebted countries in the Caribbean region with Haiti and Bolivia. The fact that we have climbed out of some of these situations has not been because we've had a godfather out there taking care of us and giving us money. We got it through dint, hard negotiations, and doing things ourselves, and creating our own innovations. And one was the Low Carbon Development Strategy of 2010, and now the 2030 Low Carbon Development Strategy, which is on a level that is far higher than that, again based on consultations. And of course, despite the fact that we have gold and we have oil and we have a resource-rich country, I'll just point out something, that in 1992, with the first free and fair elections, our country was the poorest country. And we date the emergence of our democracy from that first free and fair elections in 92, which was supported and by the President Carter and the President of Belize and the United Nations and the Commonwealth and the OES and the British Parliamentary Group and the European Union and so on. Ironically, in 2020, it is those same bodies that stand by Guyana in protecting our human rights, protecting our right to vote for who we choose, that we weren't alone in the world. And so solidarity is an important part of the human rights dimension too. But the fact that we were the poorest country, the malnutrition existed in this country in the 70s and 80s. You saw children with kwashiorkor. Some of you may or may not remember what kwashiorkor is, but red hair, not mine of course, and bloated bellies. And we had children with kwashiorkor in Guyana. We had the majority of children under the age of 5 being malnourished on Gomez, the highest Gomez scale. We have come a long way, baby. We've come a long way. And yet the the road is not ended. We still have so much more to do. But progress is measured by movement forward in a dogged way, in a persevering way, and not giving up, and with many setbacks. And the political will at the political level has to be there to doggedly keep going at it. I remember in the pre-92, the level of poverty was astounding. And so when I look back at where we are, I guess I have a visual ability, because was there, that's the advantage of being getting old. You know, there are not many advantages of getting old, but that's one of them, that I can look back in my camera brain and remember the levels of poverty and where we've come from. But the issue of housing, 20 people living in one house with one tap, one latrine, outhouse, people sleeping on the floor, on rags and sheets. And so the housing program began, this whole concept of a national housing program. And the fact that we went to the international financial institutions to get money. And they said, no, no, no. You have to sell these house lots at market price. And we said, how do we do that? 61% of the people are below the poverty line. And so we created our own housing program. We started in our own slow way, and now we are very proud that of the 18,000 house lots that have been given out in the last 2 years, as of 100,000 before that, that 44% went to single women. Their name alone is on the land title. And so I remember, I'm looking at Ambassador Lynch. We had an occasion the other day for the rights of disabled persons. And I taught her a Creole proverb. And I was teasing her. She still can't get the Creole right, but I'll teach her, you know. But the concept, which, you know, may sound boring, and Guyanese may say, what's she going on about? We always say that. One dutty build dam. One handful of earth, you know, one at a time, builds a dam. And obviously we talk about dams in Guyana because we have to keep the water at bay. We always have to be dealing with water. Whether river water, water from the rain, water from the sea, that's our psyche. And so the issue of where we sometimes think of rights as very academic. But every time a child goes to school and can attend school, that child has been empowered with their right, and they're attaining their right. When we have the cash care program that gives every child that is registered in school, from nursery to secondary, to get $25,000 and a cash voucher for their uniform, their satchel, their shoes, whatever their parents want to buy it with. From 187,000 children to 197,000 children this year. Private and public schools across the country. And that's not because our population is really expanding, it's that we're capturing more children and children going to school. So we're proud to say we've almost achieved universal primary school enrollment. We're working on secondary school enrollment to reach that universal level. And we're probably near about 80% right now. We also have the programs that my colleague Minister Vindi, and I want to thank both my female colleague ministers to be with me, and Cabinet Secretariat, high-powered lady here, as well as one of my MPs. So my female support is here. But with Vindi, the whole issues of children with disabilities, the $100,000 to go to each child, which we didn't even know where some of these children were. There was no register before. And to consult with communities in Amerindian villages and the health people to be able to find these children and make sure they have access to assistance and their families. We have also all the programs with Sonia, the right to education. Not only about going to school, nursery, primary, secondary, you know, postgraduate, university, etc., but more importantly to recognize that a lot of our children, a lot of our people may not have finished high school, And so the programs that have been created in the last 2 years, for example, and I just want to get some quick figures if you'll let me do that, and that is that in the programs that we have done with the GOLD program, which is certificate, diploma certificate, 31.9% male, 68.1% female joined the GOLD program. It's an online program linked with German university, Indian universities, University of West Indies, University of Guyana, all 10 regions. If we go to the 2022, that's approximately 7,000. Again, the same balance between male and female. The females of Guyana are just becoming very ambitious, and I mean that in a positive way, that they're grasping everything that's available to them. They're, as we say in Creole, they're not taking left, meaning they're not being left behind. And so the programs of these is to bring people up that didn't have an opportunity to finish high school. And a lot of women weren't able to for socioeconomic reasons, abuse, all sorts of things, so that access to education. And so it's not just the formal academic opportunities, it's the opportunities outside of that, using online. The GROW program, which is offering what you call GED, is that it? GED, for which the Americans would be more familiar with, for people who never finished high school, so that they can go on these online programs. It started this year. 3,139 started the program. 21% male, 78% female. And it's fascinating that the role of women in our country. So, yes, we do have abuse, we do have violence, we have to deal with that. But the fact that every meeting we have, you can have a community meeting, it's majority female. We have to now address what's going on with men. And I've been lobbying with the UN that we've always had money for women and girls, but we really have to start focusing on what are the social, psychological, economic, what's going on with the men and the young boys in our society. Otherwise, we're not going to make a change in the level of domestic violence that exists in our society. Our issues are obviously, we have rights we have not been able to, but our constitution, which we're proud of, is a progressive constitution. It is one of the most progressive in the Caribbean region, and which has an anti-discrimination clause, so that anybody who feels discrimination can go on a constitutional motion to the courts, and it will be heard. The fact that we have human rights committees, which were designed out of our political experience, out of our own political insecurities, that have Ethnic Relations Commission, Women and Gender Equality Commission, Indigenous Peoples Commission, and a Rights to Child Commission. We have not met the criteria of the Paris Principles for a national human rights institution. That's true. We have not made it. We need to build our domestic remedies and our own constitutional bodies to make sure they can carry out their mandate as required in the Constitution, that they are able to be responsive to complaints, and that they're able to win the trust and confidence of the people who they are supposed to represent. We have made, as we say, we've made progress. We are making progress. When we look at all the programs, housing and water, where many villages that didn't have wells before now have wells being put in so that people can access drinking water. And clean drinking water, not drinking from the rivers in some cases. So there are a series of wells that have been created, particularly in indigenous areas. The fact that Guyana has the only land rights legislation to do with indigenous people in the world. And the indigenous people of our country own communally over 14% of the land mass of our country. We believe we're a model for land rights issues with indigenous people. Again, when I always believe that sometimes as Guyanese, we second guess ourselves, and sometimes we feel we have all these problems. We have all these issues, and sometimes we're apologetic. And I believe that in this era that we are in our country, we have to say that we have been innovative in trying to deal with our reality, and that we have to continue to be that way. And sometimes be, as we have been, the sore thumb in some people's face, because we insist on our individuality and our own abilities. Fine, well, of course we always need technical support, we always need money somewhere. But when you look at the latest things that have come out to do with climate change, we have championed from 2010 at the global level for the commitments made by the Western world to do with support for adaptation and mitigation issues with climate change. Most of those commitments have not been upheld. And so we tried 2010, it is now 2022. We have oil and gas. And so the recent agreement with Hess for carbon services of approximately 750 million US, is that right, Marcia? Is our innovation, because we cannot, it is 12 years. We've been waiting. We have the sea out there that wants to come at us all the time. We have the rivers that raise. Right now, as we speak, in interior areas, one of the areas I work with, when the river water is low, it is now 40 feet up. 40 feet up in some of the interior rivers. Luckily, people have not built so close to the riverbanks. In many of the mining areas, the flooding has taken over into the landings and so on. So our reality is our reality. We cannot, for 12 years, constantly have floods. 2005 affected 1/4 of the population, 60% of the economy. 2006, ditto. 2021, so over 60% of our economy and agriculture was impacted by the floods in 2021, just last year. And in this year, we've had repeated floods that are what you call geographic in some cases, specific. We are not an island, so the rivers from the Amazon flow from the back of us into our rivers. We can't keep. And so this issue of climate change, and as poor developing countries, being able to get the support to be able to mitigate and adapt is a critical issue. We had a wonderful MOU with Norway that showed, again, the first country, one of the first red plus countries in terms of that. $245 million in carbon credits, one of the largest such agreements. That gave us an experience, because there are conditionalities. We do have to, it's not just giving us money like sweeties. They are arduous, they're difficult, but they help us to manage better. And so now we're into a new level. We cannot wait for these commitments that were made. So we plow on. Tell us who we should go to. Tell us who will give us the carbon credits and the carbon services. Find us someone else, and we will explore that. We'll negotiate. So I'm talking maybe some things that are not all, but these are human rights issues. The right of our country to self-determination, the right of to vote, our right to education, our right to housing and water, our right to live equally as human beings, regardless of whether we're women and men, regardless of the color of our skin, the color of our hair, whether we're disabled or not, whether we're gendered special and our own gender identities, that whether our religion, because we only read any of the US reports, we are one of the most tolerant religious countries in the world, and so we are proud. But we have so much work to do. And 2020 showed that how fragile democracies can be. How fragile. That never to take it for granted. We were on the precipice. We could have gone over. We didn't. And thanks to many factors, including our support from our friendly countries who are here, and the UN and the OAS and Canada and United States and European Union and Britain, many, many friends that held us back. But never ever be complacent about human rights. We've seen in a number of countries how quickly they have been evaporated, sometimes in very short periods of time. So we must be on guard as Guyanese. We must preserve and build and keep strengthening our human rights institutions, our judiciary, all the things that Michelle Braffett pointed out. And we could go on about some of the innovations we've done. But the point is, this is a day to assess and also just to give a perspective. We need perspective. It's not just black and white. Nothing's black and white. They need a perspective on rights at the international level, the regional levels, and country-specific. And if we can come out of today on this exhibition, just having an appreciation of what goes on in the rest of the world. The films that are on are not targeting any country, but really saying to the Guyanese people and those who attend that look what's going on in the world. Understand it, understand what's going on, and also feel empathy. We must. When I looked at the refugee one, for me it's very emotional. It's a very emotional thing. And so we have to see these rights issues as not just a piece of paper, not just as a declaration, not just a political whipping boy or girl, but really an integral part of who we are as humanity, as members of the humankind. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Minister Teixeira. So that brings us to the end of the actual presentations for our panelists. Thank you very much for all of the excellent presentations. And so we have just a few minutes before we finish off this session. So if there are any questions around the room, any comments, anything that someone would like to add to the discussions, please feel free to do so. I think everyone's sitting around the tables. You all have mics in front of you. The persons at the back, you can also contribute, absolutely. So please, any questions, comments, feedback, anything you'd like to hear? Easy. Great. Well, seeing that there are no questions or comments, I imagine that that is indicative that it was a comprehensive panel discussion and there are no gaps existing. So we'll move right ahead with today's exhibition. We have other activities happening throughout the day, as you're aware. In about 15 minutes, once we end this discussion, there is a film screening in the Dome. So there are actually 3 film screenings throughout the day, but the one immediately after this will be just about 15 minutes, so you get an opportunity to grab a drink, grab something to eat, etc. The food is on the western side of the conference center, because I'm facing that way, and, all right? Right. Right. Western side. It's easy for us because we think of the sea as being north. So it's on the western side, down at the back. There's food and more film screenings. We have a second panel discussion at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And please, if you have any questions or comments, our booth is downstairs right by the entrance. Please feel free to visit us. We have a very small presentation to make, and then we'll end off this